My question is to Jen Robinson. Both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have come out to call for Julian Assange's prosecution to come to an end. What has been the result of President Biden's cancellation of his Australian trip for this effort? And when can we expect Julian Assange to come back to Australia?
Jen.
Thank you for your question, and I have the same one. Julian Assange should be released immediately and brought home to Australia. This is an Australian citizen who has been under some form of restriction on his liberty for the past 13 years that I have been his lawyer. 13 years. He is in prison, facing 175 years in a US prison for award-winning publications for which he's won the Sydney Peace Prize, the Walkley Award for Most Outstanding Contribution to Journalism. We are grateful that we now have a government, Prime Minister Albanese, taking leadership on this issue. He is the first Prime Minister in that 13 years to call for Julian Assange's release. We're also grateful for the bipartisan support we now have from the coalition. So there's been a sea change here in Australia, but the question is, what will the United States government do about this? This is an Australian citizen whose health is failing. He is being kept away from his children. He's being kept in prison for revealing war crimes while the people who are responsible for those war crimes remain free. How much longer does this need to go on? And I also want to make sure that we make clear that the Australian public support has been so important. I go down to Canberra. We addressed a briefing room of MPs. It was packed out, standing room only, and all of them said the importance of being in that room was not only because he's an Australian citizen and the free speech implications of this case, but because their constituents are on the phone calling for this to happen. And so I think we now have unity in Australia, but the question is what the US government does with it. And the right thing to do with it is to drop the prosecution. Because what the United States is doing is prosecuting journalism. It is criminalising journalistic practices. It diminishes the moral authority of the United States to be able to raise free speech concerns with any other government. We've now got Russia using the US precedent, charging a Wall Street journalist, Evan Gershkovich, with espionage for the first time since 1987, off the back of what the US is doing to Julian Assange. We hear Chinese government officials saying, well, don't raise Cheng Li or other people in prison here because you guys are imprisoning Julian Assange. It diminishes our ability to raise free speech concerns internationally, but at the core of it, this is an Australian citizen who is in prison for award-winning publications, and it is wrong. And history will look back on this, and the question is, how long will we allow this to go on? And it's already been too long.
Wondering what your thoughts are on this case and the obligation on the United States as a very close ally of Australia to hand this man over.
So in South Asia, we watch, Julian Assange, divisive figure that he may be, he is a hero to many writers in South Asia because freedom of speech is not something we take for granted at all. And, you know, the period I was writing about in Seven Moons is about times when journalists were abducted and tortured and killed. And this happened throughout the war. And as recently as 10 years ago, even after the war, speaking truth about the past is dangerous. And you had cases where iconic editors were gunned down in broad daylight. And you're always conscious of this when you're writing, and I've been often asked why, if I'm writing detective novels, why there aren't any detectives in the novel. It's always the journalists who are the heroes. And it's simply because I think in South Asia, we don't have a Sherlock Holmes or Poirot who twirls his moustache and solves the crime, and the murders are often unsolved, and it's the journalists who go in at great cost to themselves, truth-telling, trying to find the truth to it, and end up paying with their lives. And for some reason, after 2015, Sri Lanka seemed to be emboldened. Maybe it was the rise of the internet, maybe it's because we had a government that restored press freedoms. But suddenly you had people literally on the street shouting abuse at these figures who we feared 10 years ago. But the thing is, I think in South Asia, we're watching this case with interest because we know what happens if, and myself included, even though I hide behind fiction and hide behind fictional characters, I'm very wary about making comments about contemporary Sri Lankan politics or even the end of the war. And so this luxury that you have, and the fact that journalism has been criminalized in our parts of the world, and so we are looking to you to see, and looking to the West to see how this case is prosecuted and how it ends up.
Tim Watts, when does he need to come home? How quickly does he need to come home?
Well, the reality is that the legal proceedings that Mr Assange faces, the Australian government is not a party to. They're legal proceedings of another country, and we can't intervene in those, as they can't intervene in our legal proceedings. The Prime Minister has made very clear his view, publicly and directly, to both the US and the UK government, that his view that these proceedings have continued for far too long and that they need to be brought to a conclusion. I think it's notable the breadth of the political coalition calling for Mr Assange's legal proceedings to be brought to a conclusion. I can't think of a more peculiar alignment of political ideologies lining up on this. And I have to say that within that coalition, people do not all agree about the merits of Mr Assange's individual actions. What people do agree on is that this has gone on for far too long and it needs to be brought to a close. Will there be a deal? We have made it absolutely... The Americans are in no doubt about what our view of this issue is.
OK, if we're to use what you've just said, they're in no doubt and we're a close ally, don't they owe it to us then to do this? I mean, isn't that what you do with a close friend?
Well, friends frequently disagree.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, PK, but...
I never disagree with my friends.
We've made our position very clear, publicly and privately, directly to them. There's some of the cases that people draw analogies with, saying, that was brought to a close. That occurred at the end of legal proceedings. Mr Assange legal proceedings haven't come to a conclusion yet. That does sometimes present some constraints. But we have pursued the most effective way that we can see in order to make our case with the US government.
OK, Kevin, there is an alliance absolutely on this issue. Peter Dutton has made it clear, for instance, that he thinks it's gone on too long. When does he need to be brought home? Does this need to happen immediately?
Well, look, I mean, as has been said, this has been going on over for 10 years. And look, for my region, actually, he spent part of his childhood growing up in my region. So there's a personal connection with him in my community. So there's an overwhelming belief that something needs to happen. It needs to happen soon. This has gone on far too long. OK. Jen, you happy with that?
Well, I would just say that we need to make sure that all of our MPs, the opposition, keeps the pressure on our government. We have had situations where the Australian government has resolved these cases. If the Australian government, the Howard government, was able to bring David Hicks home, he faced terrorism charges in the United States and was in Guantanamo Bay. We are talking about a journalist, a publisher, a member of the media union here in Australia, who is facing prosecution for publishing information, publishing truthful information. And the government needs to continue to make it the highest political priority.